Well-run campaigns can help candidates win a presidential election that they should lose based on the state of the country. But the opposite is true too. Plenty of candidates have dropped the ball on easily winnable presidential elections because they did a horrible job on the trail in their quest for the White House. Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 10 worst campaigns in presidential history. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and also ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Give your opinions. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related, from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. For this list, we're going to emphasize winnable elections with a couple of possible exceptions. Either through disorganization, terrible messaging, or major gaffes, all of these candidates humiliated themselves with how they sought the highest office in the land. Now let's dive in. Number 10, George McGovern, 1972. Okay, right off the bat, we're naming an election that was likely unwinnable. George McGovern was dealing with the fracturing of his own party and was facing a wildly popular Richard Nixon in 1972, who had won over the nation with the strong economy, his Southern strategy to consolidate support of the silent majority, and his beginning to draw down the Vietnam War, which included signing legislation to end the draft in 1971 and a significant reduction in troops from the region. However, McGovern's blowout was so humiliating that we couldn't leave him off this list. He won just one state, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. To be fair, Walter Mondale also won just one state in 1984, but Mondale had a more impossible task than even McGovern by running against the wildly popular Ronald Reagan and being the vice president of the wildly unpopular Jimmy Carter administration 4 years earlier. Between the two, McGovern had more of a shot. Arguably the most liberal candidate to ever run for president, McGovern campaigned on significantly cutting defense spending and establishing a universal basic income, giving every American $1,000 a year. Consensus is that extremism is what cost him, but honestly, that doesn't hold water. People forget just how anti-war the country was only a few years earlier, and as a senator from South Dakota, McGovern had the strongest track record of opposing the Vietnam War. Also, on the heels of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, UBI wasn't going to be disqualifying. In fact, during that time, it had rising interest, and cities in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Iowa, North Carolina, Indiana, Washington, and Colorado all experimented with it. Alaska, hardly a liberal state, began laying its UBI foundation during this time, which went into effect in 1982 after the Reagan Revolution, and sends every one of its residents a check, usually between $1,000 and $3,000 annually, from the state's oil and mineral revenues to this day. Simply put, it's total revisionist history to paint McGovern's ideology as too extreme for Americans at that time. The problem is when Nixon painted McGovern's platform as extreme, he backed off of pretty much everything. You think John Kerry was infamous for flip-flopping in 2004? McGovern put that on steroids. About halfway through the 1972 campaign, McGovern amended his UBI plan to put in a work requirement and means test it. So he basically campaigned on establishing a welfare program that already existed. He actually started to abandon it in the primary when challenger Hubert Humphrey criticized him. See, if you're going to go bold on policy, you can't back off it. Otherwise, you'll lose the people who want it, and the people who see you as too extreme will still see you as too extreme. But that's not McGovern's biggest flip-flop of the campaign. The most prominent issue was his first choice for vice president, Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton. Less than 2 weeks after he was nominated for VP at the Democratic National Convention in Miami, Eagleton revealed he had undergone electroshock therapy for depression 3 times in the 1960s. At the time, mental health and this type of treatment had major stigmas. McGovern handled it exactly the wrong way though, first by saying he supported Eagleton 1,000%, but then less than a week later forcing Eagleton to withdraw his name and replacing him with diplomat Sergeant Shriver. Either the McGovern should have vetted him and not picked him in the first place, dropped him immediately, or stuck with him the whole way through. Don't pick him, publicly declare your support after the revelation, and then drop him less than a week later. Here was a candidate who clearly didn't have the courage of his convictions. Although Nixon's drawdown of the Vietnam War neutralized McGovern's biggest strength on the trail, the senator also missed a big opportunity on that front. He rightly hit Nixon for expanding the war upon becoming president despite campaigning on a secret strategy to end it, and for the treatment of anti-war protesters at home, such as the killing of 4 students at Kent State by the National Guard. What he didn't do though was tie Nixon to the onset of the war with the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the war actually started not under LBJ, but under Dwight Eisenhower, for whom Nixon served as VP. That he was actually part of the administration that launched the war could have derailed the goodwill he bought from drawing down the war in '72, but McGovern never bothered to bring that up, and it's part of why he lost so badly. Number 9. Horace Greeley, 1872. The most annoying person ever to run for president, Horace Greeley was the original annoying pseudo-intellectual who changes his political positions on a whim just so he can always be the outsider opposing the person in power. He was basically the 1800s version of a political YouTuber looking for the new way to generate outrage to keep growing his audience. When you look at the electoral map and see Republican presidential candidate Ulysses S. Grant won in a landslide in 1872 with 55.6% of the popular vote and 286 of the available 352 electoral votes, you would think this was one of those elections where Grant was winning no matter what. But that's not the case. The public had already turned against Grant's Reconstruction efforts, and the corruption of people in his administration had already come to light. He was very beatable. The problem is, rather than running a candidate against him, the Democrats decided to unite around Greeley, who ran as a liberal Republican opposing Reconstruction against the radical Republicans, despite being an abolitionist just a few years earlier. As editor of the New York Tribune, Greeley notably attacked the Republican Party when it was founded and Abraham Lincoln as president for not being anti-slavery enough, even trying to launch a coup against Lincoln in 1864 to find a more radical Republican who would move faster to end slavery. Then, all of a sudden, 8 years later, he's running as president, complaining about the Republicans being too radical, all because they're trying to protect the rights of the slaves they had just freed? Talk about the original insufferable wave writer. Of course, wave writing was always Greeley's thing, dating back to when he founded the Tribune in 1841 to support the Whigs against Jacksonian politics. What a convenient time to start supporting the Whigs, just as Andrew Jackson's movement fell out of favor due to the Panic of 1837 and the Trail of Tears. His attention-grabbing antics carried over into his brief 3 months in Congress, which he won in a special election in 1848 to fill out the term of New York Rep. David S. Jackson, who was unseated for election fraud. While there, he introduced legislation to try to rename the United States the country of Columbia, just an example of how much of an attention whore he really was. Naturally, Southern Democrats and many Republicans saw through this complete facade, as is common with many wave writers and media today who lose their viewers once they get exposed, which is why Grant won so easily. This vanity project by Greeley ended in tragedy. 5 days before the election, his wife, Mary Young Cheney Greeley, passed away from tuberculosis, which she had suffered from for 20 years. The stress of losing her, and then the election was too much on Greeley, as he died exactly 30 days after his wife did. It's not clear what killed him, but he clearly suffered a physical and psychological break after what happened. But again, maybe he shouldn't have been so full of himself as to campaign for president while his wife was sick. Her health was already deteriorating after she returned from a trip to Europe in the summer of '72. Maybe, just maybe, he should have focused on her instead of his own delusions of grandeur, but we're talking about a man who lost 5 of 7 children at a young age, in large part because of his own neglect of them amid his wife's illness. Number 8. Richard Nixon, 1960. When vice presidents of popular administrations lose their candidacies for president, they had to do something wrong, and Richard Nixon was no different. There's no way he should have lost this race. Nixon was VP to Dwight Eisenhower at the time, and on the day of the election, Eisenhower's approval rating was between 58 and 59%. That should have been enough to get Nixon over the top. Sure, Nixon's opponent was the charismatic John F. Kennedy, and JFK ran a masterful campaign. Also, there was a mild recession that year, and potential voter fraud in Illinois and other states may have given Kennedy the close win, as he captured the presidency, winning 49.72% of the popular vote, a margin of 0.17% over Richard Nixon, and 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. None of that should have mattered, as the 1950s were the golden age of the American economy. In addition to Eisenhower's popularity, people were still happy with the state of the country despite the recession, and Nixon had the advantage of Southern Democratic electors in Mississippi and Alabama casting their electoral votes for third-party segregationist Harry F. Byrd in protest of JFK's support for civil rights, costing him 2 key states in his path to the White House. So how did Nixon blow it? By wasting his time on a 50-state strategy. Seeing a political realignment in the 1960s and the closeness of the election, Nixon's campaign team believed every single state was in play. So he went to every one and tried to brand himself as somebody who wouldn't write off any part of the country. All that resulted in was him wasting time in easily safe states, including Vermont, which had voted Republican in every election since the party was founded up to that point, and Georgia, which had never voted for Republican in history. That's time that could have been better spent campaigning in Hawaii, New Mexico, Nevada, Delaware, Illinois, and Missouri. None of those states voted Democrat in 1956, although Hawaii wasn't a state then, and Nixon lost them all by a combined 26,957 votes. He lost Hawaii by 115 votes on a recount after initially winning it, and the voter fraud in Illinois that we mentioned was because of Mayor Richard Daley's political machine in Chicago. But Nixon could have overcome that if he had run up the margins better in the rest of the state, which he easily could have done by spending more time there. After all, its governor was a Republican, so voter fraud against Nixon wouldn't have been a thing outside of Chicago. The 50-state strategy also hurt Nixon on the TV front. His campaign was not prepared for this new era of politics, and it tired him out severely, which is why he looked so tired and even sick in his televised debates with JFK. Those debates are now considered a game-changing moment in American politics. He injured his left knee on a limousine door while campaigning in North Carolina, which hospitalized him and kept him off the trail for a few days, even further hurting him and making him look worse on TV. But it's very possible that injury was due to him being tired from so much travel. Even agreeing to those debates was a mistake on the campaign, as the Cold War was the major political issue of the time, and Eisenhower's popularity at handling it, contrasted with JFK's youth and inexperience, was a selling point for Nixon. By allowing those debates to be broadcast, he gave JFK, who was clearly good on TV, a chance to neutralize those fears among many swing voters. Then there was the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr. in Georgia in October of that year. The Kennedy campaign used its influence over the Democratic Party to secure King's release, but it could have been Nixon getting the credit for that political win, as he could have used the influence of the executive branch's VP to secure it. After losing the black vote for good during the Depression, Eisenhower had made serious gains with that bloc for Republicans, capturing 40% in 1956 when no GOP candidate had captured more than 30% since 1932. When you add in what he did during his second term, which includes sending federal troops to integrate Little Rock, Arkansas, his support for the 1957 Civil Rights Act, and his appointment of pro-civil rights judges, 1960 was supposed to be the year that Republicans won back the black vote and became the party of Lincoln once again. But when Jackie Robinson, a prominent black Republican and Nixon supporter, publicly asked Nixon to get involved with the arrest of MLK, Nixon refused out of fear of alienating white Southerners. Beyond the immorality of that, think of the stupidity of it. Nixon alienated winnable voters in swing states to appease unwinnable voters in unwinnable states for him at that time, as the South was not about to vote Republican. It's one of the biggest tactical errors in history, and it helped the black vote consolidate even more behind the Democrats, which is what almost certainly won JFK Illinois, New Jersey, Minnesota, and Delaware. Nixon is also criticized for not using Eisenhower more, but to be fair, that was at the request of Eisenhower's wife, given his health at the time, so we won't hold that against him. And Eisenhower certainly made things harder on Nixon with his offhand comment when asked about an important contribution Nixon made to the administration.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
Still, this was a horrendous campaign, one that was very different from the effective one he ran 8 years later in 1968. Number 7. Winfield Scott, 1852. Every election around that time was about the country's schizophrenic views towards slavery, and it was no different for Winfield Scott in 1852. Lewis Cass's campaign on letting states decide whether or not to be slave or free alienated both sides in 1848 and cost him that election. But that same position got James Buchanan elected in 1856 over John C. Fremont and the upstart Republican Party. James K. Polk made this debate inevitable during his presidency from 1845 to 1849 by doubling the size of the country via the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of the Oregon Territory. In this election, Scott was running to succeed Millard Fillmore and continue Whig control of the White House. Fillmore rose to the office from VP after the death of Zachary Taylor, who won the 1848 election, and it was under their leadership that the Compromise of 1850 and fugitive slave laws were passed. Both sides of the slavery debate hated the Compromise, and Scott made the mistake of alienating both sides. He claimed to oppose slavery and support gradual emancipation, which alienated the South, but he endorsed the pro-slavery elements of the Compromise, which alienated the North. He tried to create a level of unifying nostalgia on the campaign trail by telling stories of great American war victories, most notably battles in the War of 1812, and literally nobody wanted to hear that during this time. Scott also tried to make it a personality contest and used those stories to tout his war hero status, another baffling move since his opponent, Democrat Franklin Pierce, was also a war hero from the Mexican-American War. Turning the election into a personality contest when he couldn't connect with voters made no sense, and it resulted in Pierce's election, as he won by 7 points in the popular vote and 254 to 42 in the Electoral College. Despite the landslide and split among the Whigs, Scott could have won with a clear message that brought more people to the polls, considering this election had the lowest voter turnout of any election between 1840 and 1904. Number 6. Winfield Scott Hancock, 1880. The man named after Winfield Scott lived up to the name by running his own terrible campaign 28 years after Scott lost his election. Winfield Scott Hancock was supposed to take back the White House for Democrats in 1880, but instead lost a close race by 0.11% in the popular vote and 214 to 155 in the Electoral College to James A. Garfield, who won the 6th straight election for Republicans dating back to its first ever election win under Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Hancock was a major general in the army, where he had served dating back to 1844, fighting in the Mexican-American War and for the Union in the American Civil War. He campaigned on a revenue-only tariff stance, which was about using tariffs to produce but not protect industry, and was a contrast to Garfield's support for much higher tariffs, which were unpopular at the time as the Gilded Age was underway under President Rutherford B. Hayes and was destroying the working class. However, while Hancock had the popular position, and while his background was a selling point as a decorated war hero, he managed to turn both of those things against him with one major blunder. When asked to clarify his position on tariffs, he said, quote, "The tariff question is a local question." Republicans capitalized on that quote and made it clear to the public he didn't even know what tariffs were, undercutting his position there and validating the idea that he was too stupid to be president. See, Hancock had never held public office before, so Republicans painted him as somebody in over his head who wouldn't be ready for the job. Then his campaign tried a dirty tactic that backfired spectacularly. Immigration had become a major issue because of the number of people of Chinese descent who had come to America to work amidst the growing industry out west, most notably construction on the Transcontinental Railroad, which native-born Westerners believed was depressing their wages. Both candidates campaigned on limiting Chinese immigration, but Hancock's campaign orchestrated the release of a fake letter by a group of fake businessmen assuring that Garfield would keep immigration at current levels so they could keep workers' wages low via a New York Democratic newspaper called Truth. Here's the problem. That letter was released on October the 20th, 2 weeks before the election, so it gave Garfield's campaign plenty of time to prove that letter was fake, particularly in the Northeast, where all the prominent Republican newspapers were. Hancock's team banked on news of its forgery not reaching Nevada and California in time, and he did win both states, but those were worth a grand total of 8 electoral votes. It cost him New York and Connecticut, which were worth 41 electoral votes overall, and would have been enough to win the election if he flipped them. Number 5, Thomas Dewey, 1948. This election should have been a layup for Republicans. Thomas Dewey was running as the challenger amidst runaway inflation against the incumbent Democrat, who was only there because Franklin D. Roosevelt had plucked him out of obscurity to become vice president while winning his 4th term in 1944 and then dying in 1945. The Democrats also had to deal with the split in their own party, with third-party challenger Strom Thurmond and his Dixiecrats siphoning off votes from them over their support for civil rights. Harry Truman overcame all of that to defeat Dewey by over 4 percentage points and 303 to 189 in the Electoral College. Yes, Truman ran an amazing campaign, shifting all the blame for the country's issues onto a Republican Congress, going across the country on his whistle-stop tours, reminding the country what the Democratic Party had done for it in the last 16 years, which was pull it out of the Great Depression that started under Republican leadership and win World War II against the Nazis, who rose to power also under Republican leadership. See, despite his issues, Truman had a message to sell, which isn't the case for every major party candidate. He was the one who finished the job in World War II after FDR's death and began the process of rebuilding the world, and he was the one overseeing the new growing economy at home. Dewey, who was governor of New York and had lost to FDR in a landslide in 1944, wrongly believed it was FDR's personality alone that was winning the elections for the Democrats, not his policies or the state of the country. And so in 1948, he banked on Truman losing because he didn't have FDR's charisma. His strategy was to run the Joe Biden basement campaign and not take any stance on anything. That allowed Truman to define the election on his terms, and all Dewey did was attack Truman for not being presidential. He refused all media appearances and barely campaigned, trying to run out the clock despite barely holding a lead. A key moment was when Truman called a special session of Congress to address the issues facing the country that Republicans were blaming on him. Rather than take a stance on Truman's proposals to that Congress, Dewey just called it a political stunt, and he and the Republicans began to be viewed as the people trying to keep the problems going just so they could win back the White House. When polling showed Truman cut Dewey's lead in half to 5 points in October of 1948, Dewey stuck with the same strategy and assumed Truman wouldn't be able to make up the deficit. Truman continued to barnstorm the country with his message. The result was the most shocking election upset in U.S. history, and Truman giving the Democrats a 5th straight win in presidential elections, while his party took back control of Congress, and Dewey wearing the label of 2-time presidential election loser for the rest of his life. Number 4, Henry Clay, 1844. Known as the Great Compromiser, Henry Clay's abilities in Congress to bring both sides together failed him in this campaign for president, as it alienated both sides. James K. Polk ran for president in 1844 on 3 key promises: lowering tariffs, creating an independent treasury, and continuing the expansion of the country via annexation of Texas, claiming the Oregon territories, and acquiring California and New Mexico. He was looking to restore power to the Jacksonian Democrats, who lost the White House under Martin Van Buren in 1840 due to the Panic of 1837. Clay, as the Whig, should have had an easy ride to the White House because Polk's central theme, support for annexing Texas, was being done already by the current Whig president John Tyler. While senator from Kentucky, a position he left in 1842, Clay opposed annexing Texas, but when he ran for president, he claimed he was open to it, alienating him from his northern support, but not winning over any southern support. That was terrible messaging against somebody like Polk, who was so direct. He also went back to the same platform that cost him the presidential elections of 1824 and 1832, called the American System, which proposed protective tariffs, a national bank, and federal funds for infrastructure. Opposition to those sentiments had all been solidified under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who gained more votes than Clay both times they were on the presidential ballot together and outright beat him the second time. The result was Clay losing the popular vote by roughly 1.5 points in the Electoral College, 170 to 105. But if he was more clear and willing to meet the moment, he would have won. Number 3, Hillary Clinton, 2016. The story of 2016 is two wildly unpopular candidates running for president, but Hillary Clinton ran the most tone-deaf and titled campaign in history. Many of you have seen my video on the best presidential campaigns in history and wondered why none of the ones involving Donald Trump were never on there. Well, his win in 2024 was solely over inflation, not his campaigning, and his loss in 2020 was solely over COVID. His 2016 campaign was certainly his best, highlighted by his brilliant strategy to plant himself in the Rust Belt and outflank the Democrats from the left with his messages on protectionism and opposition to war, along with his understanding that people didn't like the scripted politician anymore. However, his win obscured the numerous missteps his campaign made at the time, from getting into a public fight with the Gold Star family, to calling for federal punishment for women who get abortions, to defending his fat shaming of a former Miss Universe. Remember, he had to fire campaign manager Corey Lewandowski in June of that year. Clinton lost this election way more than Trump won it. Running as an extension of then Democratic President Barack Obama, who was popular at the time, Clinton was going to need to address the economics angst of the era, because although it had significantly improved from the Great Recession that Obama inherited 8 years earlier, many citizens in small towns across the Rust Belt in particular hadn't felt the benefits of the economic growth. While employment rose, wages were still stagnant, so the campaign was going to come down to economic messaging. Trump responded to that angst by railing against free trade deals that led to outsourcing in the Midwest, pledging to bring these jobs back. Clinton responded by saying Trump uses PP words. Seriously. The most commonly run campaign ad by Clinton was one showing Trump using curse words and then showing children watching it on TV, emphasizing his behavior rather than any policy. A Wesleyan Media Project study later revealed Clinton ran the most policy-free campaign ever, with only 25% of her TV ads focusing on policy, when every other candidate in history's percentage was 40% or more, and every other winning candidate's TV ads were at least 60% about policy. 65% of her TV ads were personal attacks. It was never greater than 15% for anybody else. It's not like Trump's behavior wasn't hurting him, but her campaign message wasn't going to draw any more attention to that given his media presence, so she was just beating a dead horse while not adding any substance to the narrative. Clinton's own track record on the policy front certainly hurt her too, most notably her vote for support of the Iraq War, and the fact that she was touting the economy when her husband Bill Clinton was president in the 1990s, despite his approval of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which many feel just shipped Rust Belt jobs to Mexico in favor of profits for corporations. She had also supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, while Secretary of State, calling it the gold standard. Trump insisted TPP would ship even more jobs overseas, and Obama was trying to get it approved by Congress in 2016. Because of pressure from Trump and her primary opponent in Bernie Sanders, who both opposed TPP, Clinton claimed to oppose the exact same deal she negotiated, but everybody in the world, and most especially the Rust Belt states with voters she needed, knew that was a lie. An obviously better strategy would have been to sell TPP as a deal that made China play by the rules and go back to selling the economy of the 90s, even with NAFTA, by highlighting how manufacturing jobs actually increased during that era. Regardless of whether or not it's good policy, you can't run from what you support. The outsourcing issue should have been a major warning sign for her in the primaries, as she lost Michigan to Sanders despite all polling showing evidence to the contrary, and the clear evidence of that was Sanders' support from factory workers because of his opposition to outsourcing. When the primary ended, Sanders supporters who had moved over to her campaign insisted she needed to go to the upper Midwest because she was losing union workers who had been so central to Democratic victories for 70 years, largely due to the damage they perceived her husband had caused with his support for NAFTA. But she didn't even bother to visit Michigan or Wisconsin. Her campaign strategy was to abandon those voters and target upper-middle-class suburbanites she thought would turn on Trump for his behavior. New York Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer acknowledged as much.
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Clinton also had multiple campaign gaffes that further hurt her with blue-collar voters on the fence. When discussing her energy policy, she said, quote, "We're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work." Then she infamously said half of Trump supporters belong in a basket of deplorables. Clinton did run up margins in the suburbs, most notably becoming the first Democrat since 1936 to win Orange County, California, but it came at a cost of losing blue-collar workers in swing states. The result was the largest gap in popular vote versus electoral vote in history, as she won the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes and over 2 percentage points, but lost the Electoral College 304 to 227 because Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all flipped for Republicans for the first time since the 1980s. This whole court the suburb strategy only worked to drive up her margins in already blue states. Speaking of Sanders, that was another major blunder by Clinton. She had to fight him off to win the Democratic primary, and honestly, all things being equal, she likely would have won no matter what, given how much she dominated with black voters, particularly in the South. However, she still used her influence with the Democratic National Committee to rig the primary in favor of herself by way of reverting funds for the party to her own campaign, having people plant questions for her in debates that were supposed to be neutral, and actually strategizing with DNC officials on the messaging against Sanders' campaign. When all of this was revealed by WikiLeaks in the summer of 2016, it created the perception that the Democratic Party had rigged the primary against Sanders, which no doubt cost Clinton with some of Sanders' supporters in the fall. This was the classic case of framing a guilty man, cheating to win what you were already going to win. Only Richard Nixon with Watergate was more unnecessarily irresponsible. Her broad campaign themes of "I'm with her" and "Stronger Together" were poor slogans too. "I'm with her" gave off the public perception that she felt she was owed this election, and it had nothing to do with what she was actually going to do for the voter. And honestly, in many ways, that's how she ran her campaign. So much of her strategy was to insist she was qualified and deserving of the office for her work in public service. Trump successfully turned that phrase on its head by saying, quote, "I'm with you" to the public. Stronger Together didn't mean anything. Sure, change in 2008, Ford in 2012, and Make America Great Again in 2016 were all simple slogans, but there was meat behind the slogans. Obama's change message meant he would be a change from George W. Bush. His Ford message meant don't turn back to the Bush economy. Trump's MAGA message meant return America to prosperous times. What could Stronger Together possibly imply Clinton was going to do for America? Notice I've left out the email scandal and even Trump's Access Hollywood tape, because neither of those are due to things directly related to the campaign. But James Comey reopening the email scandal in October is, because that happened after Anthony Weiner, the estranged husband of Clinton's campaign vice chair, Huma Abedin, was arrested for sexting a 15-year-old and had his laptop seized, and the laptop revealed email exchanges between Abedin and Clinton's private server that initially triggered the scandal. Polling showed Comey reopening the scandal may have cost Clinton. Simply put, this election had everything from scandal to policy to wild campaigns, but at the end of the day, Clinton's emphasis on Trump's behavior rather than policy cost her more than anything else, and she has nobody to blame but herself for losing that race. Number 2, Charles Hughes, 1916. The only Supreme Court justice in history to give up his seat to run for president, Charles Hughes was supposed to right the wrong of 1912. See, Republicans had held the White House from 1897 to 1913 and both chambers of Congress from 1897 to 1911, but the party split in the 1912 election between incumbent William Taft and his predecessor Teddy Roosevelt, who then formed another party to run for president after he lost the nomination, resulted in Woodrow Wilson capturing the presidency by what many perceived to be an obvious fluke. However, with foreign policy at the forefront of the campaign given the outbreak of World War I just 2 years earlier, Hughes royally dropped the ball with his messaging. Hughes relentlessly attacked Wilson for his interventions in Mexico and supporting different factions of the Mexican Revolution in an attempt to paint Wilson as an interventionist, which he was, by the way. On the other hand, Wilson bragged about keeping the US out of war overseas and framed intervention in Mexico as a way to keep out the Germans and thereby keeping US soldiers from having to cross the Atlantic to go to war. How did Hughes respond? He advocated for greater mobilization and preparedness for the war. All of a sudden, his anti-interventionist stance rang hollow, and Wilson was able to paint himself as the anti-war candidate. Of course, now we all know that was a lie, as Wilson got the US involved in the war 3 months into his second term, but that doesn't change the mistake in Hughes' messaging. Hughes also completely alienated the progressive wing of the Republican Party that went to Roosevelt in 1912 by attacking Wilson's continuation of Roosevelt's policies, most notably coming out against the 8-hour workday, completely misreading the time. A key moment was when Hughes sided with the conservative wings of Republicans in a campaign stop in California against its progressive Republican governor, Hiram Johnson, who had been Roosevelt's vice presidential candidate in 1912. So Johnson didn't mobilize the Republican base to vote for him. That cost Hughes the state of California and its 13 electoral votes by less than 4,000 votes and less than 0.4 percentage points. Since Wilson won the Electoral College 277 to 254, it cost Hughes the election, and his other blunders cost him the popular vote by 3.1 percentage points. Before we get to our number one pick, I want to address a few honorable mentions. Barry Goldwater did nothing to quell concerns about his radical views in the 1964 election when he said extremism in defensive liberty is no vice, and by suggesting nuclear strikes on Vietnam when U.S. fear of nuclear war was at its apex. But Lyndon B. Johnson wasn't losing that election no matter what a year after the death of John F. Kennedy. The same is true in Michael Dukakis' situation in 1988, who couldn't answer whether or not he would support the death penalty if somebody killed his wife, and did a ridiculous photo op in a military tank to present strength on foreign policy, but only looked silly. Still, Dukakis was running against George H.W. Bush, vice president of the wildly popular Ronald Reagan, so he was never winning that election. James Blaine and Mitt Romney were both infamous for gas on the campaign trail. Blaine lost to Grover Cleveland in 1884, largely because Republican Presbyterian minister, while welcoming him, referred to the Democratic Party as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, demonstrating clear xenophobia against Catholic immigrants, which cost him in New York that year. However, Blaine himself didn't make that comment. Romney was caught on a hot mic at a fundraiser with wealthy donors, saying 47% of the country would vote for Barack Obama no matter what because they were dependent on government. But the truth is, that was already Romney's brand, largely due to Obama's effective campaigning. And Romney actually narrowed the gap after that comment was made because of a strong first debate performance. So it was more Obama's messaging that won that election in 2012. Some people might put John McCain on here for picking Sarah Palin in 2008 as his VP, and that may have cost him more votes, but again, it was an unwinnable election for any Republican on the heels of George W. Bush. So McCain was just throwing a Hail Mary. And the number one worst presidential campaign in history? Al Gore, 2000. Don't let the controversy over the Florida recount distract you from the fact that Al Gore's severe daddy issues cost him from winning a layup election against George W. Bush. Like Richard Nixon in 1960, Gore was running as the incumbent vice president in a very popular administration. Unlike Nixon in 1960, Gore wasn't facing a challenger as charismatic as John F. Kennedy, and Gore was serving under a president actually willing to campaign for him. Bill Clinton consistently had the highest approval rating throughout his last year in office of any president since World War II, hovering around 65%. Unemployment was low, the country was in the midst of 4 straight budget surpluses with the prospect of paying off the national debt within a decade, and the US wasn't involved in any major foreign entanglements. Oh, and Gore's opponent was the son of George H.W. Bush, who lost as an incumbent president to him and Clinton in 1992 because people were unhappy with the job he did. The central theme of Bush's campaign was restoring honor and integrity to the White House, very clearly a shot at the administration's seemingly lack of moral values due to Clinton's impeachment in 1998 for the Monica Lewinsky scandal. However, Clinton's approval rating peaked the day he was impeached, and as that was going on, he became the first president since Reconstruction whose party picked up seats in the midterm elections of his second term as president. He also won in 1992 on the very simple phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," and in 2000, people were very happy with the economy. All Gore had to do was tout that message again and tie himself to Clinton at every turn. But Gore distanced himself from Clinton over the scandal despite every bit of obvious evidence that he should do the opposite. Clinton wasn't allowed to campaign for Gore at all, much to his frustration. Instead, Gore decided to try to out-personal character Bush, painting himself as the family values man by giving his wife the most cringe, passionate kiss of all time at the 2000 Democratic National Convention. He then went the October surprise route, leaking a report on November the 2nd, 5 days before the election, that Bush had been arrested for DUI back in 1976, tearing down his personal character message. This specific story, to be fair, may have flipped just enough votes to win Gore Iowa and Oregon, but it's totally outweighed by the number of votes he lost by trying to win on this playing field. In terms of messaging, Gore literally contradicted everything he and Clinton ran on 8 years earlier. He ran on his experience and contrasted it with Bush, completely forgetting that Bush's father tried to use experience to beat him and Clinton in 1992 and failed. Oh, and Bush Jr. was the governor of Texas for 6 years, second largest state in the union, so his experience credentials were more than okay. Gore also managed to alienate just enough factions of the conservative and liberal wings of the Democratic Party. The liberal wing was already frustrated with the centrism of his and Clinton's administration, and he only gave them more of a middle finger by picking Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, the most conservative Democrat in Congress, as his VP. That was while Bush introduced compassionate conservatism to the nation and branded himself as such. This message, combined with Gore's VP choice, the Clinton administration's record, and Bush's father not being that conservative of a president himself, really neutralized the traditional Democratic advantage on class-based politics that had defined the party for 70 years. And it's what led to Ralph Nader siphoning off so many votes. Nader voters made a compelling case at the time that there was no evidence Gore would be more liberal than Bush. While losing the left flank of the party though, Gore also managed to alienate the conservative wing of the party by running a populist left message behind the leadership of strategist Tad Devine, who would become Bernie Sanders' chief strategist in 2016. With Devine at the helm, Gore pledged to use the nation's prosperity at the time to invest in the needs of working people, including strengthening Social Security, expanding healthcare, and access to education, and emphasizing class warfare. It's really hard to run on that message when you're the sitting VP though, and it directly contradicts your own record and choice for VP. Gore didn't win back the upset liberals with that move, he just lost more moderates, getting the worst of both worlds. This populist messaging is what cost him his home state of Tennessee. Not using Clinton is what cost him Missouri and Arkansas. Picking Lieberman as his VP cost him New Hampshire and Florida, where the Nader votes would have made a difference. Despite winning the popular vote by 0.5 percentage points, Gore lost the Electoral College 271 to 266, so literally any of those states would have flipped the election. Obviously, the three elephants in the room are the shadiness in Florida, where Bush won by 537 votes after the Supreme Court stopped to recount, the recession of 2000 by the dot-com bubble, and Bush's likability compared to Gore's lack of charisma. None of it should have mattered. Gore could have kept Bush out of so-called cheating distance of winning Florida by picking popular Florida Senator Bob Graham as his VP, or he could have just avoided relying on the state where Bush's brother Jeb was governor at the time when there were so many other states he dropped the ball on. That recession may have been a small factor, but nowhere near enough to flip the election away from him. It wasn't a severe downturn. And while the likability difference would have always made the election closer than either of Clinton's wins, it again shouldn't have been enough to get Bush over the edge. Bush ran a brilliant campaign, but unlike 2004, where the win was more about his brilliant messaging than John Kerry's missteps, this election was about Gore's own missteps rather than Bush's brilliance. In fact, hiding the DUI from the public was a huge misstep by Bush when you know there's going to be opera research on it. Gore just made so many more mistakes, but I refuse to believe he was that naive. No, the truth is Gore, at his heart, didn't like being in Clinton's shadow. Gore's whole political career was tied to other people. Rising through the ranks as a congressman and eventual senator from Tennessee, he was just following in the footsteps of his dad, Albert Gore Sr., who was Tennessee senator from 1953 to 1971. And then Clinton chose him as VP. He felt winning the presidency wouldn't have been on his own term. That wasn't acceptable, so Gore turned down his best asset and cost himself the election. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Who would you say ran the worst presidential campaign in history? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.